Taganak Creek arises in the hills of Schuyler County, southwest of the village of Trumansburg. Its slope is gentle as it winds its way through the upland farms and woodlots on its way to Cayuga Lake. Over thousands of years, however, the stream has cut a rugged gorge on the steep hillside by the lake shore. The soil and rock eroded by the stream has been deposited in the lake, forming a small delta called Taughannock Point. Taganak Falls has eroded 3/4 of a mile back into the hillside since its origin on the lakeshore 12,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. The waterfall is 215 feet high, taller than Niagara, and is one of the tallest waterfalls in the northeastern United States. The origin of the name of the falls takes us back to the time when the Iroquois Indians, or Haudenosaunee, controlled western New York. The Six Nations Confederacy of the Iroquois consisted of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and the Tuscarora. The Senecas and the Cayugas controlled the territory surrounding the lakes bearing their names. The site of a sizable Indian village has been discovered several miles upstream from the falls along Taganak Creek, where it is crossed by Indian Fort Road. This historic marker is on Indian Fort Road near where the town was located. The town, dating from the 16th or 17th century, was protected by a palisaded wall of logs. This painting was by Glenn Norris of the DeWitt Historical Society. This low ridge of earth in the woods nearby may have been the foundation for the wall surrounding the compound. Evidence of Indian towns has also been found on Taganak Point. This historical marker is near the beginning of the trail to the falls. Wentworth Greenhalgh, an Englishman journeying west from Albany in 1677, found one of these towns. Corn, beans, and other vegetables grew in the cultivated fields. 3 old apple trees with trunks more than 2 feet in diameter were discovered in the 1920s at the site of the old orchard of this town. There are at least 2 explanations of how Taganak Falls got its name. One says that it was an Iroquois or Algonquin word meaning, as author Lewis Halsey deduced, the great falls in the woods. The second explanation is of a war between Indian nations. During colonial times, it is said, an Iroquois chief, Canasatigo, deeply insulted a number of Delaware chiefs in a council before the governor of Pennsylvania concerning a dispute over land. All the Delaware chiefs but one backed down. A chief of the ancient proud Taganak line, himself thus called Taganak, vowed revenge on the Iroquois. With nearly 200 warriors, Taganak pushed into Iroquois country, hoping to attack several towns on the west side of Cayuga Lake. Word spread of their advance, and soon the Cayugas and Senecas amassed several bands outnumbering Taganak's war party. After a few skirmishes, Taganak's group headed east towards the lake and found themselves on the north bank of Taganak Creek. The high cliffs of the gorge protected them from a band of Cayugas from the village of Neodakit, the Indian forerunner of Ithaca. However, Taganak and his men found themselves trapped by another band near the Great Falls. Realizing they were doomed, they fought valiantly, inflicting heavy losses on the Cayugas. Taganak inflicted mortal wounds on the local chief before Taganak himself was struck down. Lewis Halsey, a local resident, wrote in 1866, "Tradition tells us that his bleeding but not yet lifeless body was thrown over the precipice into the depths below the falls, and most of his band shared his fate." The Delaware name Taganak came to be affixed to the falls. The Cayuga town at Taganak Point continued to flourish until the 1770s, but then the Iroquois became caught in the middle of the struggle between Britain and the rebelling colonies. The Six Nations Confederacy, an alliance which had made the Haudenosaunee the most powerful Indian empire in eastern America for centuries, was divided. This is Joseph Brant, a famous Mohawk chief, who argued that if the Americans were to win, they would take more Iroquois land. 4 nations, including the Senecas and Cayugas, ended up aiding the British. In 1779, George Washington sent an army under General John Sullivan into the Finger Lakes region to destroy these powerful British allies. Several thousand soldiers burned villages and destroyed crops wherever they found them. The army did not seem to have discovered the village at Taganak. The inhabitants apparently left anyway. They left little behind that the invading army could have used. This picture is a painting by Glenn Norris, imagining the Cayuga Tutelo town, Corriorganal, in the town of Ithaca, being burned by Colonel Dearborn's troops in September 1779. After the war, a settlement was made with the Cayugas concerning most of their lands, and the military tract was created. This large territory was surveyed and mapped, and acreage is awarded to soldiers in payment for their war service. Some veterans sold their lands. Others came and started settlements. Samuel Wayburn was the first white settler on Taughannock Point. His hospitality saved the life of Abner Treman, who survived to found Trumansburg. Richard and Benjamin Goodwin arrived from Pennsylvania and played an important part in building up a new community. This headstone is in a small cemetery near Taganak Farms Inn. Benjamin Goodwin constructed a grist mill on the north side of the creek as early as 1797. Later, a distillery was added. This distillery created a great impetus to the growth of the settlement, opening up a market for grain unable to reach distant towns and cities. The grain refuse was fed to large herds of cattle. A successful general store opened. Other industries were begun. In the age before railroads and good highways, Goodwins Point, as it was then called, became the most important market and shipping point on Cayuga Lake. As more settlers moved to the area, hamlets sprang up all along Taganak Creek: Mecklenburg, Waterburg, Podunk, and Halseyville, each with a mill pond, grist mills, and small shops. Nickel Halsey came from Lodi in 1808 and built this fine house, which still stands. Nickel Halsey also built the Halseyville Mill, where New York State Route 96 now crosses the creek, then known as Halseyville Creek. Lewis Halsey constructed this covered bridge over the creek at Halseyville around 1833. The state tore down the covered bridge in 1927 and replaced it with a concrete structure. A gun factory was constructed during the War of 1812 upstream from the present Jacksonville Road Bridge over the Upper Gorge. You can see the gun factory in the upper right of this picture. The gun company manufactured guns for the government during the war. After the war ended, the factory was used at different times as an oil mill, flax mill, and tobacco house. The foundation of the mill stood until about 1920, when its stones were used as a base for road building. The community at Goodwins Point flourished until the 1830s. Steamboats carried freight up and down the lake. Other prosperous ports arose along the lake to compete with Goodwins, most notably Port Deposit or Trumansburg Landing, now called Frontenac Point, the present location of Camp Barton, a Boy Scout camp. The connection of Cayuga Lake with the Erie Canal system in 1828 opened up many new markets for local agriculture and industry. Goodwins Point fell into decline. During the 1840s, tobacco was grown on the point. In the 1850s, Henry H. Smith of New York City and John Jones, Jr. of Philadelphia built a paper mill on the point that was a success in spite of an erratic water flow. The Geneva and Ithaca Railroad connected Taganak with the rest of the world in 1873. A station was constructed by Gorge Road near the bridge over the Upper Gorge. The name later changed to the Geneva, Ithaca, and Sayre Railroad. The trip from Ithaca eventually was reduced to just 20 minutes. Sandstone exposed above the Upper Gorge was quarried in several locations and hauled by team and wagon to a planing mill near the railroad bridge over the gorge. There it was smoothed and shaped, and then it was shipped by train to New York and other cities to make sidewalks until about 1903. The railroad also brought a steady stream of vacationers traveling from Ithaca and communities farther south. They would take a carriage to one of the new resort hotels on the gorge rims. Visitors from the north would take a steamer to Goodwins Point, where they would get a carriage to one of the two hotels. Lewis Halsey described the Taganak House. The Taganak House, a substantial and spacious wooden building, stands in a pleasant grove a short distance below the falls. Here the travelers always find excellent accommodations. From either story of the house, the fall is visible through the leafy trees. The easy swing and rustic seats are each arranged to command a spectacular view. The perfume of pine fills the air with healthy fragrance, and its whispering music floats upon the breeze. A dramatic view of the falls could be had from the overlook, which was a great place for a group portrait. Annie Douglas Payne, a resident of the Taganak area around the turn of the last century, described the hotel as she remembered it. The hotel was a sprawling building with two long wings toward the back. The front section held the offices and parlors, with another parlor and sundeck on the upper story. The bedrooms were on the upper floor of both of the wings. They were small, with just an iron bed, bureau, and 2 chairs. The lower floor of one of the wings had a ballroom decorated with lights. Along the roads and paths near the Taganak House were chairs and benches and various shelters and gazebos. Nearby was the annex to accommodate additional guests. Quoting William H. Bogart, a visitor to the Taganak House in the 1860s, "The view of the falls from above is not that which enables Taganak to be seen as its beauty deserves. The next route is to pursue that plain and well-marked road, keeping near the edge of the ravine, with care to the footstep, until an entrance is seen to the long staircase, which admits a passage to the gorge below. This ladder of steps is a great convenience, and a safe one to all of a steady head. There is a defined path at the end of these steps, a sort of Indian trail tread, which can be easily followed, and it leads to the foot of the falls." Mr. Halsey described reaching the falls thus: "At length the sudden curve in the banks brings us unexpectedly in full view of the great fall. Here the chasm widens, and the more lofty walls form a spacious amphitheater. On either side the stone masses tower majestically upward and seem to shut us in by an impassable barrier. Before us, from the frowning cliff hundreds of feet in height, the mad waters take their terrible leap." The falls were also visible from overlooks on the south side of the gorge, which was called the American side, in imitation of Niagara Falls. Here the Cataract House served vacationing clientele as well. During the period of July 3rd, 4th, and 5th of 1875, 962 meals were served here. In August of the same year, between 1,000 and 1,500 meals were served to a reunion of the 126th Regiment in a grove behind the Taganak House across the chasm. Unique vistas of the falls and gorge were afforded by unusual lookout structures near the Cataract House. The Cliff House must have given tourists a thrill, and the view of the falls from this side was just as suitable a spot for a portrait as was the opposite cliff. The upper gorge above the falls was frequently visited and admired by 19th century visitors to the hotels. Railings and observation decks were built right near the brink of the cataract. Some people tested their nerve and luck. The upper gorge is now off limits to the public. It was possible to cross the upper ravine by staircases and this interesting footbridge. A path led past numerous little cascades to the upper fall at the head of the ravine. On July 2nd, 1879, a workman near the Taganak House unearthed this stone man under the driveway. It was an instant sensation. People came by the hundreds to see it at 25 cents a look. Newspapers statewide carried the story of the Taganak giant. Some scientists, doctors, and clergymen claimed that the man was a genuine fossil. Eventually word got out that the stone man had been made from beef blood, iron filings, eggs, salt, and sand, and was baked in an oven by John Thompson, owner of the hotel, and a friend. The operators of the hotels were always looking for ways to bring new visitors and revenue. A stunt was staged in 1874 when Professor Jenkins of Canada walked on a 2-inch rope stretched across the 1,200-foot width of the gorge. He claimed to have done the same at Niagara Falls in 1869. In both rain and wind he performed several feats while over the center. To see the spectacle, seated admission on the cliff top cost 50 cents, 25 cents to stand. John Jones, Jr., who along with Henry Smith had constructed the old paper mill in 1853, fell in love with the Taganak area. He built this beautiful house in 1873 and planned a grand summer resort for Goodwins Point. Mr. Jones passed away before he could realize these dreams, and his family lived on in the mansion for many summers. In the 1940s, the home was leased and then sold for use as a restaurant called the Taganak Farms Inn. A large addition to the dining room, looking over the point and Cayuga Lake, was constructed in the early 1980s. But getting back to the last century, the lip of the Great Falls was different then from its appearance today, as you may have noticed in the pictures. Instead of being indented as it is now, the lip projected out as a point. In 1895, owner R.V. Jones had planned to seal a gap that had been forming between the overhanging slab of rock and the rest of the cliff. All the material had been ordered and the masons were ready to start when heavy rains came and prevented them from working. Then winter came and they had to wait longer. They waited too long. The crash of the falling rock from the top of the falls was heard by farmers all around, and the appearance of Taughannock Falls was changed for the approaching new century. Electricity came to Taganak about 1905. The Ulysses Light, Heat and Power Company built this hydroelectric plant in the gorge by the railroad bridge just below the upper falls. It depended on siphoning the water from a dam upstream down to a dynamo at the base of the cliff. The neighborhood had power for about 12 hours per night until about 7:30 in the morning. All that remains of the power plant today is this concrete flume trough by the Park Road. The popularity of the hotels waned at the turn of the century as the public began to travel rather than seek summer homes. Robert H. Treman of Ithaca acquired the Cataract house from Dr. Edward Meany and in turn offered it to Tompkins County for use as a tuberculosis hospital for about 30 patients in 1912. In 1935, the building and lands passed to the state for use as a parkland. The old Taganak house declined in use after about 1905. Finally, in 1922, the Taganak house burned. A parking lot and a falls overlook, visible in the lower right of this picture, were completed by the state by the early 1930s on the site of the once popular resort. The Finger Lakes State Parks Commission was created in 1924 by the state legislature and placed under the authority of the New York State Conservation Department. The acquisition of land and creation of a state park at Taughannock Falls was a high priority. The first purchase of land for the new park was made in January 1925 for 64 acres. That summer, the infant park was open to the public. Over the years, more property has been acquired amounting to more than 700 acres today. A draft for park literature in 1927 reads, "It is planned to provide baseball fields, tennis courts, and a quarter-mile cinder track, also a special recreation reserve, one on each side of the stream, one for boys and the other for girls. Some permanent camps for leasing for short periods are to be constructed on the north." The writer continues, "One of the largest single items of the construction has been the building of a single arched stone and concrete bridge over the lower end of the gorge, which connects up the proposed boulevard on the north and south side of the glen. In 1936, a secondary stone arch bridge was constructed to serve as an emergency flood relief opening, as well as providing an underpass for pedestrians under the main park road. The late 1920s and the 1930s were a period of widespread construction in the park. Taganak Park Road on the north side of the gorge was constructed. In 1933, the state completed Route 89 up the west side of the lake, making the scenic wonder accessible to a larger population. Park crews worked hard preparing for the public. They built roads and trails, campgrounds and picnic areas. They built walls, steps, bridges, and banks. The civilian conservation crews provided a great deal of the labor in the 1930s. A cabin area was built on the north side by the lake. A bathhouse was constructed on the south point, along with the swimming area. East of the swimming area, a pier was put in. A terrible flood in 1935 destroyed much of the work of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Most of that year and considerable portions of subsequent years were devoted to repair of the damage. This is Route 89 in the park after the flood. But at last, the dream of a state park at Taganak had become a reality. The changes since the 1930s have been less dramatic. More land has been acquired. A new headquarters for the Finger Lakes State Parks Commission was built in the park in 1961. The railroad bridge is now a trail bridge and is the north end of the Black Diamond Trail connecting 3 state parks in Tompkins County. Subtler changes have taken place as well. In the early 1900s, a rare peregrine falcon nested on the gorge wall near the falls. But the use of DDT wiped out the peregrine in the eastern United States by the 1960s. In 1975, Cornell ornithologists released 3 young falcons from this box just below the north rim. A great horned owl foiled their project at Taganak, however. Peregrines were released at other locations in the country free of the big owls. Because of the banning of DDT and reintroduction efforts, the peregrine falcon was able to be removed from the endangered species list in 1999. Since 1979, concerts on Taughannock Point have been a very popular tradition. Exhibits explaining Taganack's rich natural and cultural history have been installed along the Gorge Trail, at the Overlook, and other locations. And now, in the 21st century, Taganak has entered the electronic cyber age.